Here in the Austrian Alps, 3,500 years ago, expert Bronze Age miners dug deep shafts and galleries down into the mountain. In the flickering light cast by tapers and oil lamps, wearing tough leather shoes and protective headwear, they climbed down timber scaffolds, ladders and stairways hewn from the pine trees felled on the slopes above. They excavated using stone hammers and bronze picks, hauling their prize to the surface in baskets and bags. But these ancient miners were not pursuing veins of copper or tin ores down here in the darkness. Instead, they were chasing another precious substance. Known as halite, or rock salt. Extracting and trading this valuable resource helped make the chiefs of the region rich and powerful, as the Bronze Age became the Iron Age and their Proto-Celtic culture transformed Europe. But this wasn't the first place in Europe to grow rich from the production and trade of salt. Thousands of years earlier, during the Neolithic, the first farmers of Europe founded a settlement over a salt deposit that was so prized the town would be occupied for 1,000 years as it transformed into a fortress to protect this valuable substance and the riches it provided. Across prehistoric Europe, there were different kinds of salt sources, extraction methods and processing techniques carried out from the brine springs of the Carpathians to the rock salt mines of the Alps and the salt marshes of eastern England. But what was all this salt used for? Who did the hard work at these sites, and who might have ruled over them? And how did salt production and trade transform these societies from the Neolithic to the Iron Age? This is the surprising story of how salt transformed prehistoric Europe. This video is sponsored by Raycon. I use these headphones every day. They're Raycon's everyday earbud my work. On this selectable audiobook of paper is accessory. Everyday. We take salt for granted today. It's so easy to shake it, grind it, or sprinkle it onto your food, whether it's table salt, sea salt flakes, or ground rock salt. This salt is sodium chloride, and for us animals, it's far more than just seasoning. Sodium and chloride ions are fundamental to our biological functions. Without adequate salt intake, we can get symptoms like fatigue and muscle weakness, and a severe lack of sodium would ultimately be fatal. Fortunately, it's an abundant mineral, naturally occurring in the environment, and our hunter-gatherer ancestors would have got adequate sodium from the diets they ate, especially from the meat and blood of the animals they hunted, and from certain plants they collected. The amount of salt found in the soil and taken up by plants, and the animals that eat them, varies depending on geography. Salt is of course mostly found dissolved in seawater, and generally there will be more salt in soils closer to the coast. It's possible that during the Paleolithic and Mesolithic, hunter-gatherer groups made intentional journeys to salt-rich regions to ensure their continued good health, in a similar way to how animals instinctively go to salt licks and consume mineral-rich clays when they need to. But this kind of behaviour doesn't generally leave detectable archaeological evidence. The salty waters off Europe's coast weren't the only salt sources available, however. Sodium chloride forms a stable crystalline mineral we call halite. There are massive underground deposits all over the world that were once ancient salty seas, perhaps hundreds of millions of years ago. These can be in complex layers between sedimentary rock and can form salt domes over geological timescales that can reach the surface or near enough to access with quarrying. Mining these formations was very rarely done in prehistory. but these underground deposits can interact with groundwater, dissolving the halite and coming to the surface in natural brine springs. It might be that Mesolithic hunter-gatherers utilised these brine springs, and there have been attempts to map Mesolithic activity in the form of stone tool finds, for example, to known brine spring locations. Because Mesolithic people didn't tend to change their environment very much in ways we can see archaeologically, we can't really see how they processed the brine, or if they did at all. But there is some evidence from southeast France. Pieces of worked timber from a brine well have been radiocarbon dated to about 5700 BC, the end of the Mesolithic era in this region. The timbers might have formed a small enclosure for solar brine evaporation, the sun slowly evaporating standing brine to leave the salt residue behind, which could then be harvested. And at the same sort of time, perhaps even earlier, to the east, the first farms of Europe were spreading through the Balkans. Groups expanded along the river valleys looking for new lands to colonise. It's thought that these early agricultural societies might have sought out additional salt sources, especially if their diets relied more on cereal crops than meat, and especially as they moved away from coastal regions. They would have likely had to provide their animal herds with additional salt too. This may have meant accessible salt sources were one of the considerations when founding a new settlement, along with access to other resources like fresh water, timber and clay. Because of the underlying halite deposits, the eastern Carpathian region has many salt springs. The site called Poiana Slatina in Romania, which means salt spring meadow or clearing, has been called the earliest salt production site in the world, although other places claim that title too. The oldest radiocarbon date estimate goes back to 6000 BC, and this is the earliest appearance of a type of salt processing artifact called briquetage. This is the term given to a coarse ceramic specifically produced for the boiling of salt. These pots were smashed open to access the salt cakes inside, and so were single use, leaving great mounds of waste over time. Enormous quantities of these ceramics were produced at some processing sites in prehistoric Europe, and these landmarks have been noticed for a long time. The name briquetage was coined in 1740 by a French military engineer and antiquarian who noted these mounds of brick-like material where he was working in eastern France. Here in the Carpathian region, this salt production technique was in use from the first Neolithic settlements onwards into the Chalcolithic era. Different brine springs have different concentrations of salt, and these can change depending on the season and rainfall. And the salts could have been collected and used as brine. Certainly that's one way local people continued to use the brine springs into modern times, pouring brine into soups and being used to preserve dairy and so on. But to make salt crystals, the water had to be evaporated. So from the Neolithic onwards, ceramic containers made of local clay were filled with brine and gently heated by fire to evaporate the water, leaving behind salt crystals inside. The ceramic container was then broken open, leaving the salt cakes to be collected, transported, stored and used. These broken chunks of ceramic were discarded, and these remains are what archaeologists call briquetage. And briquetage is generally the best form of archaeological evidence for prehistoric salt production, as it's found at sites right across Europe for thousands of years, from the Neolithic into the Iron Age, although it was not the only technique used. Probably at these Neolithic sites, the work was seasonal and small scale, produced by and for the local settlement. Salt would have been used to season the food of people and animals, of course, and also for the preservation of meat and in the processing of hides. Improving nutritional storage like this might have helped these communities better survive seasonal food shortages. Better health would have fueled the population growth seen at this time. As the Neolithic societies here developed metalworking and other new technologies in an era we call the Chalcolithic, they also became more complex societies that saw craft specializations within and between settlements and the development of long-range trade networks. Settlements in this era reached into new territories as they sought to control specific resources like copper ores, and they were usually protected with defences like banks, ditches and palisades, sometimes at a huge scale. And one remarkable settlement we know of, near Provadia in Bulgaria, seems to have specialised in salt production. This is the location of the only large salt deposit in the region. Salt extraction has been carried out here for thousands of years, and the salt springs here were first exploited in the Neolithic, perhaps around 5500 BC. The huge occupation layer here, known as a tell, is named Solnitsata, or the Salt Works, and it's sometimes called Europe's oldest town. Clay ovens and ceramic pots were used within the Neolithic settlement and at the nearby brine springs to produce salt. Occupation and salt processing continued into the late Chalcolithic to around 4500 to 4200 BC, which is when the whole region saw systemic decline. This site was part of the Chalcolithic trade networks that exchanged gold and copper from the Balkan Mountains, spondylus and other shells from the Aegean, and other resources like obsidian, all as raw materials and in the form of finished tools and ornaments. Just 40 kilometres away from Solnitsata is the famous Varna Cemetery, the site with the oldest gold treasure in the world, the burial site of the world's first elite metalworkers and chiefs, buried with an abundance of metal weapons and ornaments. The settlement here at Solnitsata was protected by fortifications like a defensive ditch or moat, stone walls, stone bastions, and wooden palisades. It's these encircling defences and the economic and trade specialisation that leads some to conceive of the site as a kind of proto-urban settlement or town. There's also evidence of ritual activity taking place here and nearby, and a Vinci culture style model mask has been discovered. Excavations are carried out for 2 months every summer, and there's still an enormous amount to be uncovered. You read about places like this, and you can't help but imagine what life would have been like for those living here over 6,000 years ago. The population was probably only a few hundred people at any one time. Their work would have included collecting and transporting the brine, cutting timber for the fires, collecting clay for the ovens, and for making the evaporation jars. They would have made bags and baskets for transporting the salt cakes, and built and crewed boats for paddling their produce along the river for trade with neighbours like the metallurgic masters of Varna. You wonder what their spiritual beliefs were like, what they thought about the nature of this special substance that emerged from the earth, surely like a gift from the gods of the underworld. The other site that fires my imagination is over 1,000 kilometres away to the northwest and dates to the Bronze Age, the salt mines of Hallstatt. There's a surprising amount of research on prehistoric salt once you start looking. The best single overview is the book by Anthony Harding. There's another popular book called Salt: A World History by Mark Kurlansky, which is a pretty fun read. Popular book looking. The best single is a surprising amount of research on prehistoric salt once you start looking. The best single overview is the book by Anthony Harding. There's another popular book called Salt: A World History by Mark Kurlansky, which is a pretty fun read, and there's many academic publications about specific sites or regions. As always, I'll leave some key sources in the description below. In the Bronze Age in Europe, most salt was obtained through salt springs and by processing seawater in coastal regions. I'll talk more about that later, but both methods used briquetage to evaporate the brine by heating. Some places though also mined halite, rock salt, directly. Probably there were places quarrying exposed halite where it was accessible at the surface. Most places that did that have continued being quarried, and so all ancient workings have long since been obliterated. But there are a few hints here and there still surviving, like from Transylvania and Ukraine, where wooden troughs with holes in the bottom have been discovered and were used somehow in salt processing. Hollowed out tree trunks from Romania have been dated to the Bronze Age, between the 16th and the 9th centuries BC. There was industrial level processing in this region, involving clay-lined wicker tanks, some of them with roofs, to store brine. The troughs they carved might have been used to drip fresh water onto rock salt deposits below. The holes along the troughs had wooden plugs, themselves with tiny holes in that held twisted cords dangling down. dissolving sections of the exposed halite directly beneath the drips, creating weak points that could be cracked open and pried apart. This has been tested and it actually works, by the way. Another hypothesis that has been tested and found to work is that they poured brine into the troughs and let it drip out slowly, perhaps onto textiles below where salt crystals would form for collection. Proper mining, digging shafts and galleries beneath the ground, was a highly skilled and dangerous activity. Most prehistoric mine works, like copper and tin mines for example, were destroyed by later mining activities in the same area, and that probably happened to salt mines too. However, in the famous salt region of Hallstatt in Austria, some of the prehistoric mine workings survived. Most of them are from the Iron Age, when the salt mining intensified in scale, but they started deep salt mining here in the Bronze Age, as far back as 1450 BC. Wooden structures were built underground, like scaffolds, and this surviving staircase, which has been called the oldest surviving wooden staircase in the world. The timber for it was felled in 1344 BC. What's left of it is 1.8 metres wide and 8 metres long. You can tell by the angle of the treads that it was steeper in its original position, and it might have been built to let miners cross heaps of mining spoil. There are other parts of staircases found in the mines too. The high salt content of the mine's atmosphere severely restricts microbial activity, preserving organic material, including wooden tools and leather clothing. We don't know for sure who would have worked down here in the flickering light of these spruce and fir tapers and oil lamps, but the salt mine was of vital importance for the people that controlled it in the Urnfield period. These people are known from the thousands of Bronze Age and Iron Age burials here, the extraordinary abundance of graves, human remains and material culture in the form of grave goods has provided an enormous insight into the era, the early Iron Age especially. This huge cemetery gave its name to the Proto-Celtic Hallstatt culture, which was enormously important and influential right across Europe. The Bronze Age saw the emergence of chiefly elites who would grow in power throughout the era through control of local resources, such as salt, from the mines here in Hallstatt and nearby Doornberg near Hallein, and the concentration of wealth in the hands of warlords wielding bronze and then iron swords. In the Iron Age, say between around 800 BC to 100 BC, salt production reached an unprecedented scale and sophistication right across Europe. Technological advancements and population growth drove demand and supply, and increasingly complex societies required both reliable food preservation and commodities for exchange. Most of the archaeological evidence for European salt production comes from this era. There were salt production sites in Mediterranean coastal regions where sea salt could be evaporated by the power of the sun alone. But in northwestern Europe, it was too cold even in summer to do that. And this is where archaeologists and antiquarians discovered these great mounds of smashed briquetage at sites where seawater was concentrated and evaporated. In eastern England, these mounds of brick-coloured debris were called Red Hills. One of the highest concentrations of these ancient structures was in coastal Essex. The stretch of the River Blackwater between the town of Malden and Mersey Island has long been famous for salt production. It's home today to one of the world's premier sea salt brands, Malden Sea Salt. The salt marshes are premier sea salt brands, Malden Sea Salt. The salt marshes along the north banks of this tidal river, through the local currents and tides, and the repeated inundations and evaporations, have accumulated a high concentration of salt. The creeks here are so salty that traditionally boys from across the area were brought here to learn to swim, benefiting from the increased buoyancy provided by the salt. And the air and soil is so rich in salt that local orchards better survive late frosts. And the sheep and cattle reared on the salt marsh are especially healthy and delicious. The salt works here continued in different forms through the Middle Ages into the modern period, shaping the character of these places and the people. There are villages and streets named after salt, and the salty creeks and salt marshes create this landscape that's not the sea, but isn't quite land either. In the Iron Age, the communities here likely produced salt seasonally and at relatively small scale. They used different methods to concentrate the salt, from digging a series of clay-lined pits to using wooden troughs, and finally boiling the brine in ceramics and creating the mounds of briquetage later antiquarians named Red Hills. There are over 300 red hills known from Essex alone. Similar sites can be found dating to the Iron Age and the Roman period of Britain right across England, usually concentrated in estuaries. As well as for local production, the resulting salt was traded inland to the population centres where demand for salt was highest. Different techniques were often used at different contemporary sites, suggesting that idiosyncratic methods were developed and passed down through families and communities, even when contemporary sites were so close they were in view of one another. These mounds of spoil, created over generations, remind me a bit of Mesolithic shell middens created by hunter-gatherers. On one level, it was just a pile of industrial waste, but on another, it was a monument to your work and to your ancestors who had stood where you stood and had done the work that you were doing and had passed on their skills and wisdom through the ages. There's some suggestion they did see the Red Hills a bit like this, with possible ritual depositions and even nearby burials relating to the Red Hills, seemingly attaching some ritual spiritual significance to these structures. Today, the Red Hills of Essex have been flattened by seawall flood defences and ploughed flat by farmers, but fragments of briquetage can still be seen on the surface, at the edge of the ploughed land or in the sea wall, or eroding from the muddy banks of the salt marsh. Coastal production complemented inland mining and salt spring exploitation, meaning that from the Iron Age onwards, salt was widely available across much of prehistoric Europe. These distinctive local traditions would often continue into the Roman and later historical periods, when large-scale salt pans were established on Mediterranean and Atlantic coastlines, some of which continue to be used today. There's this phrase or idea that you see repeated sometimes, that in the ancient world, salt was more valuable than gold. I think most people know that that was never the case, and this idea may have come from a misunderstanding of the transatlantic trade, where gold was plentiful and salt was hard to come by. But salt could have great value in prehistory, depending on the time and place, and some communities and some people would have grown wealthy and powerful from its production and trade. It's something we take for granted today, but for some of our ancestors, as far back as 8,000 years ago, as they transformed this special substance through complex processes, so salt had the power to transform their communities, helped shape their ways of life, and influence the course of European history. If you like these kinds of videos, please subscribe to my channel so you can see more videos like this in the future, and your subscription really helps me out too. Thank you very much indeed to my patrons and channel members for supporting my work. Your contributions help me to obtain all this wonderful footage of ancient sites and the salt marshes of Essex. If you haven't joined yet, please do so using the links in the description below. Now, to find out more about prehistoric mining, please watch this video on the largest copper mine of the ancient world, the incredible Mines of Kargally. There were many productive copper mines throughout Bronze Age Europe. There were mines along the Atlantic coasts, from Ireland and Britain down to Brittany and Iberia. One of the most famous and most productive was the incredible Great Orme mine on the north coast of Wales. This mine was so large that it produced perhaps 2,000 tons of copper, enough to transform the British Isles and make its rulers extremely wealthy. In Central Europe, the mines of the Eastern Alps were even more productive. The richest mine of all there produced an estimated 20,000 tons of copper, which would have been enough to produce staggering numbers of swords, shields and armour. In southern Europe, from the Balkans to the Aegean Islands and across to Anatolia, there were mines producing copper that fueled the ancient civilizations of the Near East. The island of Cyprus was famous for its production, extracting and exporting its ingots to Egypt and Mesopotamia and right across Europe. But none of these were as large or as productive as a mining complex here, at the furthest reaches of Europe, on the steppes between the Ural Mountains and the Caspian Sea. Almost 4,000 years ago, massive mining works completely transformed the landscape. They dug vast numbers of vertical shafts into the bedrock and then chased the veins of ore by digging a staggering network of interlinked tunnels extending for hundreds of kilometers. Their excavations were so extensive that experts estimate they produced up to a staggering 150,000 tons of copper during the Bronze Age. But what society was conducting operations of this scale out here on the steppe? How did they find these ore deposits so long ago? Where did the miners live, and how did they carry out these works? And what ultimately happened to them? This is the story of what ancient mining experts have called the largest prehistoric copper mine in the world, the incredible Mines of Kargali. Before we journey to the wild landscapes of the Bronze Age steppe, I must thank this video's sponsor, Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus. Tacticus is an exciting, turn-based, tactical strategy game set in the grim darkness of Games Workshop's Warhammer 40,000 universe. In Tacticus, you bring some of Warhammer's most powerful warriors to high-energy tactical skirmishes, and you must use superior tactics to deliver victory. In this game, you get to lead over 70 Warhammer 40,000 champions from 17 playable factions. They have different combinations of weapons, abilities and upgrades, so each character feels unique on the battlefield. You must work out how to utilize them effectively in the battles as you progress in the various game modes. There's campaign missions, PvP, live events, guild raids and much more. Whether you're already a fan of Warhammer 40,000 like me, or if you're new to this universe, now's a perfect time to pick up the game. You can download the game for free today using the link in the description below, or by scanning my QR code that's on the screen. And when you log in, use the code NOVHELLO and claim your reward of 2,000 gold and 50 Blackstones, available until December 1st. Thank you to Tacticus for sponsoring the video. This enormous mining centre is found on the open steppe landscape of the southern Urals, in what's Russia today. There are copper deposits spread over about 500 square kilometers along the valley of the river Kargalka, a tributary of the Ural River. This region was first exploited for its copper in the early Bronze Age. There was a settlement 70 kilometers to the west, dated to 3800 to 3360 BC, associated with the Repin culture. The Repin culture was actually an early Yamnaya culture, ceramic style, unique to this region. Excavations of the settlement revealed Kargali copper ore, slag and copper tools. This settlement was seasonal. They mined at Kargali, then brought the copper here for processing in the summers. And activity at the Kargali site itself was carried out by the Yamnaya culture after about 3000 BC. The Yamnaya were mobile herders, but they were also metal workers, extracting ore and making copper axes and knives. Their presence at Kargali is attested by the burial mounds they built in the area. Excavation of one of these cemeteries revealed the burial of a young man dated to about 2900 to 2700 BC, who was interred with grave goods including a valuable copper axe and an axe mould, perhaps evidence that he had been a metal worker in life. But the Yamnaya mining at Kargali seems to have stopped after 2500 BC. It did not start up again until 1900 BC, when it continued for perhaps 6 centuries until around 1300 BC. This phase of mining was carried out by the Shrubnaya culture. They were steppe herders too, but they also had many settlements throughout the Pontic steppe, from the Urals to the Black Sea coasts. Their ancestors had been mining elsewhere in the southern Urals for centuries, and societies like the Sintashta culture to the northeast had also become mining and copper working experts. Copper was necessary for these societies to function, and those who controlled copper sources could become enormously wealthy and powerful. You have to wonder how those Yamnaya people first discovered the copper mineral ores in the Kargali region. When we think of mining, we automatically think of rocks and mountains, and certainly that's where most copper ores were discovered in prehistory. These ancient prospectors would see hints of the blue-green malachite or azurite ores in outcrops, and so have an idea about where to begin excavations. But out here on the steppes, the bedrock is covered by many meters of earth. However, it's likely small regions of bedrock jutted up close to the surface here and there, on the steppes and in the river valleys. The Yamnaya and later Shrubnaya prospectors would have spotted the blue-green minerals and followed the veins down into the earth. Apparently, modern people have noticed that certain types of vegetation favour certain copper-rich environments. It's just speculation, but perhaps spotting copper-loving plants growing helped them to find these deposits too. It took a huge amount of labour to even begin ore extraction at Kargali. The ores are embedded in sandstone beneath the alluvial soils at depths of up to 12 metres. The ore deposits extend another 90 metres below the surface of the bedrock. So the miners would excavate huge amounts of earth to find ore-bearing sandstones beneath. Once they found ore, they dug vertical or inclined shafts 10 to 12 metres down. Amazingly, when archaeologists discovered and excavated these shafts, they found handholds dug into the rock. Imagine climbing up and down these circular shafts in and out of the mine 3,500 years ago. Once they dug down into it, they began tunnelling outwards, following the ore in every direction, often down to depths of 40 metres. The sandstone was soft, which made the work easier than at some other mines, and yet the tunnels were therefore more prone to collapse. Where they struck it rich, the tunnel systems became extensive, excavating underground chambers up to 20 metres or 65 feet high. These networks of tunnels often connected to one another, creating a labyrinth of several hundred kilometres beneath the surface. The many exploratory workings left the landscape forever pitted with craters. The copper mines of Kargali cover an area of around 140 square kilometres, with an estimated 35,000 surface features connected to mining, with thousands of mine shafts, drift mines, prospecting pits, and the underground tunnels. The soft rock here meant they could excavate with the same kinds of tools they used 4,000 kilometres away in North Wales at the Great Orme mine. Antler and bone picks made from cattle bones, cattle shoulder blades and shovels, and large stone hammers. Also, like at the Great Orme, they manufactured and used bronze picks too. Not only do they find the tools here, they can see evidence of their use still etched into the walls of the mines today. So what did they do with all the ore they extracted? What impact did this industrial scale activity have on the environment? And where did all these miners live? Archaeologists have discovered around 20 settlements connected to the late Bronze Age mines at Kargali. The most well excavated one, called Dorney, is located on a low hill inside the mining complex. Initially, when the settlement was founded, there were pit dwellings occupied only seasonally, but over time they established permanent houses along with smelting facilities and ritual areas. Archaeologists only excavated part of the settlement, of course, but they found 120,000 sherds of pottery from perhaps 6,000 pottery vessels. And they recovered about 2.5 million animal bones, mostly cattle. They also found 4,000 finds of copper, from raw copper to ingots and finished metalwork, along with 190 casting moulds for the production of axes and daggers and copper pits for the mines. They carried out the initial stages of copper production here by crushing the ores with hammerstones and sorting out the minerals for smelting. And although some smelting was done here, it seems a lot of the ore was shipped off for smelting further south and west, where there was more wood for fuel. A 1 kilogram ingot of copper required the burning of 65 kilograms of charcoal, which was obtained from about 500 kilograms of dry wood. Considering the scale of the extraction here, experts estimate that 75 million metric tons of wood were consumed. This used up all the local wood in the region, requiring the ore export for further processing. It's been theorised that the wood supply problem was what ended production here, rather than running out of copper. This Bronze Age Shrubnaya settlement at Dorney really fires my imagination. Imagine living in the middle of that Bronze Age industrial zone. It must have been something like a boom town in the Old West, or more likely one of those horrendous cobalt mines in the Congo or Uganda, where they extract the minerals needed for the batteries in our phones and cars. I imagine the Bronze Age settlements had rulers and overseers, skilled workers and slaves, and the people supplying all their needs. Excavations also revealed features interpreted as ritual sites or ritual activities. There may have been mass sacrifices of cattle for enormous feasts. There were so many cattle, in fact, that some speculate they were brought in for trade as a form of payment, rather than just food. Many pits in the settlement seem to have ritual deposits inside, and there were many stone objects interpreted as phalluses inserted into the ground. I know there's this idea that anytime an archaeologist can't work something out, they just call it ritual, but this kind of ritual activity is common in ancient mines. It's obviously a very dangerous activity, and one that involves going down into the earth, into the darkness, being enveloped by it, being separated from the normal world on the surface. You would want to placate the gods, especially the Earth Mother and the chthonic gods of the underworld, and whatever nefarious gnomes, knockers, and spirits dwell down there. This is surely why miners left offerings behind when they were done, and why they took the time to close shafts with backfill rather than leave them open, in case anything came crawling back out when they weren't looking. The enormous amount of copper produced was used to create tools, weapons and ornaments for the people of the Shrubnaya culture for centuries. It created a metal boom that enabled the success of this widespread, long-lasting society. And they produced so much that they were able to export it to the copper-hungry civilizations of the Near East and the Mediterranean. In fact, new research suggests that the copper in the earliest known oxhide ingots found on Minoan Crete was not from Cyprus at all. It may in fact be imported all the way from Kargali. Tracing the origins of copper artifacts can be done by analysing their chemical compositions and comparing trace elements and lead isotope ratios to source locations. Different places have unique chemical fingerprints. After 1400 BC, all known copper oxide ingots can be traced to Cyprus. However, they may have adopted this form from imports and then made it their own, turning it into a kind of Cypriot brand even. Or it's possible that foreign copper was imported in other forms and then reformed into the oxide shape for further export. Either way, the metal in these early ingots, dating to between 1550 and 1450 BC, came from the southern Urals region. It's thought they were exported across or around the Caucasus into the Mitanni kingdom, and from there to Cyprus or through Anatolia and on to Crete. But whether through exhausting the fuel supply or due to widespread climatic changes after 1300 BC, or a combination of both, the mine workings likely came to an end, along with the Shrubnaya culture as a whole, by about 1200 BC. This period saw widespread changes across the Old World, especially in the Near East, and much disruption to long-range trade routes and large-scale migrations. On the steppes, after the Shrubnaya, the demand for copper and bronze would fade as the Sumerians and Syrians emerged to dominate in the Iron Age. The mines of Kargali and the scarred, poisoned land was left to be reclaimed by nature for about 3,000 years, before Russian prospectors started using modern methods to extract what was left in the 18th and 19th centuries, when they obtained another 130,000 tons of copper. The best book on prehistoric mining that I know of is by William O'Brien. I'll leave a link to it below. Please remember to download Tacticus for free today using the link in the description below or by scanning my QR code. When you log in, don't forget to use the code to claim your reward. And as always, thank you very much indeed to my patrons and channel members. Now, please watch this video all about the incredible Great Orme mine and how it transformed Bronze Age Britain. Thank you for watching.
Hooked up to the refinery. In the classic 1993 Tim Burton film, The Nightmare Before Christmas, the main character, Jack Skellington, the king of Halloween Town, finds himself wandering in the forest, worn by the monotony of his unchanging life, when he happens upon something quite unusual, quite new. A ring of trees in the forest, on each of which is a door, each of a unique design. Jack, of course, chooses to open the most eye-catching door of them all, the decorated conifer tree with a gold star atop it. In doing so, he falls into a portal and discovers a completely new world of which neither he nor anyone else in Halloween Town has ever heard. Christmas Town. Have you ever wondered what that might be like? To suddenly discover something as huge, as rich, as wondrous as Christmas? Would you like to find out? Hidden on the calendar, in between the widely observed and cherished holidays of the Western world, are the holidays we forgot about. Traditions no less magical, exciting, and to those of the past who kept them, important as the ones which have survived. Ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome to Fire of Learning. Thank you for joining us in this video as we explore several of these forgotten holidays. Before we begin, we'd like to mention that holiday history can be a complicated subject, very often underestimated in its complexity. Many holidays are older than most countries and spread across much of the world, varying throughout it. We've done our best to avoid oversimplifications, but it still needs to be said that there is generally more to each of the holidays that we are going to discuss than what is presented here, because this video is more introductory and can only be so long. Also, we'd like to mention that anything said in this video is of course subject to change if contradictory evidence arises that proves us incorrect. Now then, let's get to it. Let us begin with a holiday which many have likely heard of in some form. Indeed, it is probably the least forgotten holiday on our list, being, in fact, celebrated in over 50 countries, and a very big celebration in some of them at that, but which, in many other areas, is largely unobserved, and as mysterious as the masqueraders who celebrate it. It is a holiday known by many names, but to our English-speaking audience, it is perhaps best known as Mardi Gras. In the United States, Mardi Gras is a holiday closely intertwined with the French culture of Louisiana. It's easy to think that Mardi Gras is unique to New Orleans, or even that it started there. However, Louisiana Mardi Gras is, in fact, merely a piece of something much larger and much older. To understand Mardi Gras, we have to zoom out and begin with Easter. Easter, as you may know, is preceded in many Christian denominations by a period known as Lent. To understand Mardi Gras, we must understand Lent. This will take a moment, but bear with us. In the United States, Lent is known as fish sandwich on a Friday night season. However, for the theological definition, Lent is a period in which various Christian groups like Catholics, the Eastern Orthodox, and many, though not all Protestant denominations, focus more intensely on things like penance, abstinence from certain foods and activities, fasting, prayer, charity, etc., in preparation for Easter. How exactly Lent is observed varies depending on the type of Christianity that is practiced. Even within branches, there may be variation. However, generally speaking, Lent begins 40 days, not counting Sundays, and so 46 days overall before Easter, and ends on Easter Sunday. Technically, for a number of groups, Lent ends on the Thursday before Easter, but then the rules still apply until Easter, but we're not going to focus much on details and variations like that. Just know that many such exist. For example, today, mainstream Catholics typically observe the following rules for Lent. On 2 days, the day Lent starts, a day called Ash Wednesday, and the Friday before Easter, called Good Friday. Everyone beyond a certain age, not pregnant or nursing, and in proper health, is required to fast, meaning eating only one full meal and 2 smaller meals, these 2 being no larger than the full meal combined, and abstain from eating meat, excluding seafood, which is categorized separately. Furthermore, Catholics are not supposed to eat meat on any Friday throughout the year, with some exceptions. Many Catholics do not follow this rule, partially because they are allowed to substitute it with another form of penance in places like the US, but emphasize it during the Fridays in Lent. Beyond this, devoting extra time to prayer, charity, and other forms of piety are heavily encouraged. Often, people will choose to sacrifice various other things that they enjoy during Lent as well. Weddings, festive celebrations, and things of this nature are traditionally discouraged during Lent. Most other forms of Christianity that observe Lent do something similar to this, although Protestant denominations are often a bit more relaxed, while the Eastern Orthodox are more strict. The rules have varied throughout time, however, with the modern Catholic rules only having been adopted in the 1960s. Traditionally, the requirements were more demanding. Indeed, as one goes back through history, the rules become more and more strict. To truly understand and empathize with why Mardi Gras developed, we must look at Lent in the Middle Ages. Throughout the Middle Ages, Lent often involved eating and drinking nothing until either after sunset or 3 p.m. every day of Lent, and then only one simple pescatarian meal, as abstaining from not just meat, but animal products in general, meaning dairy and eggs as well, was required. This fasting was lifted on Sundays, but generally not abstinence. Furthermore, historically, breaking the rules of Lent was far less acceptable than it is today, often carrying social, if not legal consequences, and so people made effort to hold to them. Lent has a long and complicated history. The rules have varied by region and changed throughout time, relaxing gradually throughout the Middle Ages, but for the most part, this is how medieval Lent worked. It wasn't, and isn't, meant as a fun time, but rather as a time intended for spiritual growth. As we said, Lent, for most denominations, begins 46 days, or 40 days excluding Sundays, before Easter. The date of Easter changes each year because of how early Christians decided it should be calculated. As a result, many things, like Lent, as well as a few interesting events that come after Easter, move with it. However, Easter, of course, always falls on a Sunday, and so Lent always starts on a Wednesday, the aforementioned Ash Wednesday. Now, prior to Lent, various Christian groups observe a period of preparation for Lent, including a 3-day period before Ash Wednesday called Shrovetide. The purpose of this pre-Lent season is to do 3 things. The first is for Christians to reflect on what spiritual challenges they face so as to prepare to focus on these in particular during Lent. The second is to seek forgiveness for their past sins. This is what the Shrove in Shrovetide means. To be shriven is to be granted absolution, or to be forgiven for your sins after confession. The third is, well, party. Christians were historically encouraged to use up all the meat, dairy, eggs, and things such as this in their homes in the final weeks and especially days before Lent began, and, furthermore, to get all of the merrymaking and festivity out of their systems before the austerity required of it. These circumstances are practically begging for a huge celebration, and this is where we finally get to Mardi Gras. The day before Ash Wednesday quite naturally took on significance as the last day to live it up before Lent. This day is called Shrove Tuesday, also known as Fat Tuesday. Mardi Gras is French for Fat Tuesday. Because Easter can fall on any date between March 22nd and April 25th, Shrove Tuesday can fall on any date between February 3rd and March 9th. For example, in 2026, because Easter is on April 5th, Shrove Tuesday is on February 17th. Both Catholics and Protestants use the term Shrovetide, but the word carnival is often used as well, especially among Catholics. The word carnival seems to come from Latin, meaning either the removal of meat or the farewell to meat. However, carnival is closely intertwined, but not perfectly interchangeable with the term Shrovetide. Shrovetide is, again, the 3-day period preceding Lent. Carnival overlaps with this period, but the carnival season traditionally begins all the way back on January 6th, which is the day after the 12 days of Christmas traditionally end. Carnival celebrations can occur at any time in between January 6th and Shrove Tuesday, with many variations depending on the specific culture. However, Shrovetide and Fat Tuesday in particular are almost universally the climax of the carnival season. Indeed, so much emphasis is on Fat Tuesday specifically that, in America, the term Mardi Gras can refer to the entire carnival season and its events, even though Mardi Gras is just the last day of carnival. This is an outrageous amount of terminology to introduce all at once. Feel free to pause the video and look at this labeled calendar for reference. And so now for the fun part. What do people typically do throughout this time? Pre-Lenten celebrations in some form can be found anywhere there is Christianity. Celebration varies by region and has also varied across history, but there are similar, relatively consistent traditions across the world. much of it is what you would expect from a holiday many call Carnival. Carnival celebrations often feature parties, balls, festivals, parades, and events like these. Celebrants will often dress in bright, vibrant colors and adorn masks and costumes. The costumes that are worn on Carnival can vary quite a bit even within cultures, but today you will often find people dressed in historical and mythological costumes as clowns, knights, animals, and things of this nature. A defining symbol of Carnival and some other pre-Lent celebrations, however, is the mask. The tradition of wearing a mask for Carnival dates back centuries. Carnival celebrations are traditionally intended to be a kind of time outside of time, or a world outside of the world, when social norms, rules, and boundaries are relaxed, or even reversed. Within reason, of course. Usually. We can't speak for every party. The mask encourages this, allowing revelers to enter this world and relax a bit, to be themselves freely, and for the community as a whole to casually intermingle without regard for things like social class or status. Masquerade balls in particular are common in, and in fact have their origins in, Carnival. That being said, masks have sometimes been prohibited or regulated at Carnival parties. Indeed, often, identities are known even when masked, but there is still a tacit agreement that a certain amount of silliness and absurdity should be tolerated on Carnival. Usually within reason. Cities didn't typically burn to the ground, though historically, Carnival was a holiday that could get out of hand, and had earned a bad reputation as a result. While the various pre-Lenten holidays may be Christian traditions, in truth, the authorities of the various Christian denominations that observe one could easily be annoyed by the excesses of the holiday, and are sometimes still. As a result, in some cases, in places like New Orleans, there were efforts to clean Carnival up and make it a more tame holiday, much like what happened with Christmas. In other places, it was outlawed altogether for various reasons. Rulers like Napoleon, for example, feared that masked drunken crowds could pose a threat, and banned Carnival when he occupied Venice. Parades are another common Carnival occurrence, found all over the world. These may occur in day or night. Feasting, especially on the rich, indulgent foods that traditionally will soon be banned, is another major aspect of Carnival and pre-Lent celebrations in general. Indeed, some areas that don't even have much of a pre-Lent celebration will still observe a kind of tradition during Shrovetide in which such foods are consumed. Shrove Tuesday is sometimes known as Pancake Day in places like England, for example. Pancake-eating races have been taking place in England during Shrovetide since the 15th century, and continue to this day. In American cities with large Polish populations, like Detroit and Chicago, there is Pączki Day, a pączki being a kind of donut introduced to these cities by Polish immigrants. Let's zoom in now on a few specific celebrations to get a more detailed look at how some of them have taken shape, starting with Mardi Gras in the United States. Carnival is of course not popular in America, but there are multiple regions which do observe it in some form. The most famous example is of course Mardi Gras in Louisiana. Indeed, the celebration here has had such an influence that most major American carnival celebrations are modeled off of it, and, as we said earlier, are even called Mardi Gras celebrations, even in areas without a French background. Prominent Mardi Gras celebrations take place in various places across the US, however, especially across the Gulf Coast region in cities like Mobile, Alabama, Pensacola, Florida, and Galveston, Texas. As is standard, celebrations can begin weeks before Fat Tuesday in these regions, but tend to culminate on it, ending once the clock strikes midnight on Ash Wednesday. Vibrant, elaborate costumes and decorations of all colors can be seen in an American Mardi Gras celebration, but the defining three colors are purple, gold, and green. Why? In 1872, they were chosen by the Rex organization in New Orleans as the colors for their inaugural parade, but no one knows exactly why. There are various theories, but it may simply be that the colors are fun and looked good together, and as a result, stuck around and came to be associated with the holiday in general. From atop their floats, crews, Krews, who, by New Orleans law, must wear masks while on the floats, will often throw what are called throws, which can be various fun objects like candy, toys, and Mardi Gras beads, into the crowd. Mardi Gras beads are another distinguishing symbol of the holiday. Today, gold, purple, and green plastic beads can be found all over the place anywhere there is a Mardi Gras party. They are worn around the neck and even hung as decorations. King cake is another defining aspect of American Mardi Gras. Historically, king cake, also called Three Kings cake, was associated more with Epiphany. Epiphany is the name of the holiday that falls on January 6th, which, again, marks the beginning of the carnival season. January 6th, for the record, is also called Twelfth Night, because it is by some, but not all definitions, the 12th night of Christmas. That's a topic for another time. The cake is named after the three kings or magi, who are said in the Bible to have visited Jesus shortly after his birth and bestowed gifts onto him. This is one of the events which Epiphany commemorates. However, in 19th century Louisiana, the cake began to become associated more with Carnival in general, and is today closely associated with Mardi Gras in America. A Mardi Gras king cake is traditionally a round brioche cake, today often decorated in Mardi Gras colors. Traditionally, an object called a fève, like a fava bean, a pea, a coin, or a plastic baby, is hidden within the cake. The fève is meant to represent the baby Jesus. Whomever receives the piece with the fève in it is awarded some kind of honor upon the night. This may